What if everything you believed about the perfect family was a carefully constructed illusion? What if the smiles were masks, the unity a facade, and the very foundation was crumbling beneath the surface? For decades, America watched one family present an image of unshakable faith, boundless love, and impenetrable unity. They were the epitome of a certain ideal, a blueprint for conservative family values broadcast into millions of homes. But behind the camera flashes, the TV specials, and the rigidly controlled public persona, a storm was brewing. A storm of secrets, of pain, of unthinkable pressures. And now, the unthinkable has happened. The cornerstone has cracked. The headlines you never expected to see are blazing across the screen. Duggar divorce shocks nation. Michelle and Jim Bob split leaves family broken. This is not just another celebrity breakup. This is the shattering of an American icon. A story not of two people, but of 22. A story of a family empire built on specific principles, now facing its most public and devastating collapse. How did we get here? What forces, hidden in plain sight, could lead to this moment? And what happens to the intricate web of relationships when the center cannot hold? This is a deep dive into the anatomy of a family fracture. Buckle in. For the uninitiated, the name Duggar is synonymous with a very specific brand, the mega family. Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar first entered the public consciousness through a series of TLC specials, culminating in the long-running reality show 19 Kids and Counting. Their identity was their size, their faith, and their seemingly unwavering commitment to each other. They weren't just a family, they were a movement. A testament to a lifestyle prioritizing modesty, courtship over dating, homeschooling, and a profound devotion to their religious beliefs. Michelle, the perpetually sweet-voiced mother, with her signature long hair and modest skirts, represented the ideal of a joyful helpmeet. Jim Bob, the enterprising father, with his real estate ventures and political aspirations, was the patriarch, the provider, the decision-maker. Together, they weren't just raising children, they were building a legacy. Every photo op, every interview, every episode was a brick in the wall of their public image. The children, from the oldest Josh to the youngest Josie, were extensions of this project, well-mannered, uniformed in their beliefs, and always presented as a cohesive, happy unit. But behind this polished image was an engine, a complex machinery of beliefs, rules, and economic necessity that kept the Duggar brand running. The show was not just a TV program, it was the family's primary financial engine. It funded their lifestyle, their large home, their travels. The pressure to maintain the image wasn't just about reputation, it was about survival. The narrative of perfect harmony was the product they were selling. And for years, America bought it. We marveled at the logistics. The laundry. The meals. The coordinating outfits. We saw the orchestrated chaos as charming, even inspiring. But what we didn't see, what couldn't be shown, was the immense psychological weight of living under a microscope while adhering to a strict, unforgiving code. The children, particularly the older ones, weren't just siblings. They were buddies in a complex childcare system, where the older girls took on maternal roles for the younger children. The family functioned as a self-contained unit, with Jim Bob at the helm, often controlling not just major life decisions, but also the courtships and early marriages of his children. The first major crack in this pristine image appeared not with the parents, but with the oldest son, Josh. In 2015, the world learned of a past scandal involving Josh and some of his sisters, a scandal the family had known about and handled privately years prior. Then, in 2021, Josh was arrested and later convicted on charges of receiving and possessing child sexual abuse material. He is now serving a lengthy federal prison sentence. This was a cataclysmic event for the family, both personally and publicly. It forced a reckoning with the narrative they had built. The show Counting On, which had replaced 19 Kids and Counting, was canceled. The family's platform evaporated overnight. But through it all, Jim Bob and Michelle stood together. They issued joint statements. They appeared in court together. They presented a united, if grieving, front. The message was clear. The marriage was the rock that would withstand even this. The patriarch and matriarch were immutable. Or so we thought. The years following Josh's legal troubles were marked by a retreat from the spotlight. The family's social media accounts, once bustling with updates and promotional posts, grew sporadic. The younger children, who had grown up entirely on camera, began to fade from public view. The older, married children, Jana, John David, Jill, Jessa, Jinger, Joseph, Josiah, Joanna, began to carve out their own public identities, often with varying degrees of distance from their parents' strict beliefs. And here is where the observant eye might have noticed the subtle tremors before the earthquake. Jill Duggar Dillard and her husband Derek became the most vocal about their estrangement from Jim Bob's financial and emotional control. They spoke of contract disputes, of being underpaid for the show, of psychological wounds from their upbringing. Jinger Duggar Wallow, influenced by her husband Jeremy, a pastor from a different theological tradition, began to publicly critique aspects of the belief system she was raised in, specifically the toxic teachings of Bill Gothard, which had profoundly influenced her parents. These were not outright rebellions, but they were public deviations from the Duggar party line. The monolith was showing fissures. But what of Michelle and Jim Bob? Their public appearances became rarer. When they did appear, usually at a child's wedding or a grandchild's birthday, the dynamic seemed different. The once effusive physical affection, the constant hand-holding, the doting glances seemed more perfunctory. The burden of the last decade was etched on their faces. They had navigated national scandal, the collapse of their family's TV empire, and the fracturing of their children's unanimity. The strain was multifaceted. First, the financial engine was gone. The show's income had dried up, but the responsibilities, the property, the remaining children at home remained. Second, the theological foundation of their marriage, based on a very specific interpretation of patriarchal headship and wifely submission, was being questioned, not just by the culture, but by their own daughters. Third, and perhaps most profound, was the unspoken grief and trauma of Josh's actions and incarceration. A tragedy of that magnitude can either bind a couple together in shared suffering or become a wedge, as each person processes guilt, blame, and anguish in isolation. Rumors, of course, swirled in the online forums dedicated to the family. Whispers of separate living arrangements. Hushed speculation about Michelle spending more time with some of her married daughters. Comments about Jim Bob appearing alone at political events, looking weary and diminished. But without confirmation, they remained just that, rumors. The family's ability to control information, honed over years of reality TV, was still formidable. The silence was a wall. The announcement, when it came, was not a joint, tearful interview. It was not a carefully staged photo. It was, according to sources, a matter of legal necessity that leaked to the press. Divorce papers had been filed. The split was not amicable in the traditional sense. It was described as involving complex divisions of assets, properties, and, most painfully, the future of the minor children still at home. The news was a detonation. For followers of the family, it felt paradoxically shocking and inevitable. This was the one thing the Duggars were never supposed to do. Their entire brand was built on the permanence of marriage, the covenant that withstands all. Divorce was presented as not merely a failure, but a spiritual failing. For Michelle and Jim Bob to choose this path suggested a breakdown so complete that no other option remained. So, what was the final straw? We may never know the full, private truth, but we can infer from the patterns. Imagine the accumulated pressure. The public humiliation of Josh's crimes, a pain no parent can truly fathom. The financial freefall. The gradual, painful realization that the methods you used to build your family, the rigid control, the isolation, the public performance, may have contributed to its deepest wounds. The dawning awareness that your children are healing by moving away from you. For Michelle, who dedicated her entire adult life to being a wife and mother within this specific framework, what identity remains when the framework collapses? For Jim Bob, whose identity was as the leader, the provider, the patriarch, what happens when the family no longer follows, the provision falters, and the title feels hollow? Their marriage was the command module for a vast and complex ship. And that ship had been hit by multiple torpedoes. They were no longer piloting it together. They were just trying to keep it from dragging them both under. The aftermath within the family is described as chaotic and heartbreaking. Allegiances are forming. Some of the adult children are reportedly rallying around Michelle, offering her emotional and even physical shelter. Others, perhaps more traditional or financially tied to Jim Bob's ventures, are maintaining a cautious neutrality. The younger children still in the home are caught in an impossible situation, their worlds split in two. The once unified Duggar brand is now a battleground of legal filings and private anguish. This is not a clean break. It is a messy, painful unraveling of a tapestry woven over nearly 40 years. The divorce proceedings are expected to be lengthy and bitter, involving not just houses and cars, but potentially the rights to the family's name and likeness, the very tools Jim Bob used to build their empire. The irony is cruel. The assets they accumulated by selling their image of unity are now the prizes in a fight that proves that image was false. And so, we are left here at the cliff's edge of this story. The headline has been written, but the chapters that follow are still being lived in private agony. This is where the documentary would traditionally offer conclusions, wrap up the narrative with a bow. But this story refuses to be wrapped. Because the real questions are only now beginning. What does faith look like for Michelle and Jim Bob, individually, after this? How does a belief system that condemns divorce accommodate its occurrence at the very heart of its most famous family? Will there be a public reckoning, a tearful interview, a joint statement asking for prayer? Or will this fracture finally allow for a long overdue silence, a retreat into genuine, unobserved privacy? How will the children navigate this? The older, married ones have their own families, their own platforms. Will they speak out? Will they choose sides publicly or maintain a fragile peace for the sake of the younger siblings? For the daughters like Jill and Jinger, who have begun to process their own trauma, does their parents' divorce validate their journeys or complicate them with new layers of sympathy and obligation? And what of the legacy? The Duggar name is now associated not with wholesome family values, but with scandal, hidden pain, and now divorce. The blueprint is revealed to be flawed. The millions who look to them as an example are now forced to confront a devastating reality. The cultural impact of this shattering cannot be overstated. This story is a Greek tragedy played out in the age of social media. It is a cautionary tale about the cost of building an empire on a perfect image. It is a human story about two people who, under the most unimaginable pressures, found their bond irreparably broken. But it is also a story without an end. The cameras may be off, but the lives continue. There will be court dates. There will be awkward family gatherings. There will be grandchildren who ask difficult questions. There will be birthdays and holidays, and all the milestones that once demanded a united front, now navigated on separate paths. The final scene of this chapter is not a resolution. It is a doorway into an unknown, painful future. Michelle and Jim Bob Duggar are no longer a unit. They are two individuals facing the consequences of a very public life and a very private collapse. The family is broken. And the process of picking up the pieces, individually and apart, has only just begun. The world watched them build it. Now, we are left to watch what happens when it falls. Stay tuned. The story is far from over. You just heard the detonation. You felt the shockwave. But in the echoing silence of a family shattered, the most critical questions are only now forming. We ended with the fallout, with the broken pieces scattered across the landscape of their very public lives. But what happens next? In the cold light of legal documents and the hushed conversations behind closed doors, a new, more brutal chapter begins. This isn't just the end of a marriage. It's the beginning of a war for the soul and the wallet of the Duggar legacy. Who will control the narrative now? Who gets the assets? And most importantly, who gets to define what the Duggar name even means for the next generation? Welcome back. The fracture is just the preface. Now, we enter the labyrinth. Let's strip away the sentiment for a moment and look at the cold, hard mechanics of this split. Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar didn't just share a home and children, they were co-CEOs of a family corporation. Their assets are not simply a house and 2 cars. We're talking about a complex web of real estate holdings across Arkansas, commercial and residential properties acquired over decades, often in the family name. We're talking about the potential residuals, the licensing rights, the very footage of their lives that was sold to TLC for years. This is where the divorce moves from a personal tragedy to a high-stakes corporate dissolution. Sources close to the family's inner circle suggest the initial filing was just the opening salvo. The real conflict is over control. Jim Bob, the perennial patriarch and businessman, is reportedly fighting to maintain control of the bulk of the assets, arguing they are tied to his business ventures and necessary to provide for the minor children still under his roof. A roof Michelle may no longer share. His perspective, as inferred by those familiar with his mindset, is one of stewardship. He built this empire. He must manage its dismantling to ensure stability. But Michelle's camp, which reportedly includes several of her older daughters and their husbands, sees it differently. Their argument? Michelle was not just a wife, she was the star. Her image, her fertility story, her soft-spoken demeanor, her very identity as the mother was the cornerstone of the brand's marketability. For decades, her labor, both domestic and televised, was the product. Should she not have a substantial, even majority, claim to the financial fruits of that labor? This isn't just about alimony. It's about back pay for a lifetime of non-unionized reality television stardom. And then there's the thorniest asset of all, the family's story itself. Who owns the rights to tell it? If a tell-all book is written by Michelle or by one of the children, does Jim Bob have any claim? Can he stop it? The battles being waged in attorneys' offices are not just about dividing property. They're about dividing history, narrative, and future revenue streams. This financial tug-of-war exposes the central irony of their downfall. The principles they preached de-emphasized worldly wealth and championed simple living. Yet, the empire they built in service of those principles now has them locked in a very worldly, very complicated, and undoubtedly expensive legal battle. The kingdom of heaven, it seems, has a very robust earthly accounting department. While the parents battle in court, the adult Duggar children are navigating a minefield of loyalty, trauma, and their own public personas. There is no unified front. Instead, we see a spectrum of responses that map perfectly onto their individual journeys away from the family compound. On one end, there are those like Jill Dillard and Derek. Having already engaged in a very public financial and emotional reckoning with Jim Bob, their path seems clear. Sources indicate Jill has been a primary support for Michelle, offering not just emotional shelter but also guidance. Derek, with his legal education, is rumored to be informally advising Michelle's team. For them, this divorce may be a tragic validation of their decision to break away. Their social media, once a battleground, has grown silent on the issue, a strategic, perhaps legally advised, silence. Then there are those like Jinger and Jeremy. Their departure has been theological and geographical. Living in Los Angeles, they've built a brand on thoughtful deconstruction and spiritual reform. For them, the divorce is another data point in their critique of the rigid, formulaic system they were raised in. Expect their public commentary, when it comes, to be framed through the lens of spiritual abuse and the failure of patriarchal systems, rather than taking a specific side against either parent. In the middle lie the enigmas, like Jana, the oldest daughter who never married and remained in the family home. Where does her loyalty lie? As a primary caregiver to the younger children, is she with her father in the house, or is her heart with her mother? Her silence is the most profound, her position the most precarious. She is the Switzerland in this war, but her homeland is being divided by the day. And what of the others, Jessa, Joseph, Josiah, Joanna? They have maintained more traditional profiles, staying closer to Arkansas and the family's original beliefs. For them, this divorce is a profound theological and personal earthquake. Their public platforms have gone mostly dark. The pressure they must feel is immense to support a father who represents their belief system structure while aching for a mother who embodied its heart. Their choice may not be public, but it is being felt in every strained family gathering and every unreturned phone call. The minor children are the true pawns in this game, their custody and living arrangements likely a key point of contention. Their world has been one of routine and rigid structure. Now, that structure is not just bent, it's being legally severed. The psychological impact on them is the greatest unknown and the most tragic consequence of all. This is perhaps the most complex layer of all. The Duggars didn't just live their faith, they marketed it. Their brand was built on the teachings of the Institute in Basic Life Principles, IBLP, and figures like Bill Gothard, which emphasize patriarchal authority, female submission, and the absolute indissolubility of marriage except in cases of outright adultery. So, what theological justification can there possibly be for this? Jim Bob and Michelle's spiritual advisors, their home church, their entire belief ecosystem is now facing a crisis they never prepared for. The standard script, pray, forgive, reconcile, submit, has evidently failed. The rumors swirling suggest the split may not be citing biblical grounds like adultery, but something murkier, emotional abandonment, irreconcilable differences, or, in the stark language of law, the marriage is irretrievably broken. This creates a seismic schism in their spiritual world. If they divorce without a clear, publicly accepted biblical reason, are they excommunicated in spirit if not in practice? Does their community shun them? Or does the community, faced with the undeniable human wreckage, begin to quietly reinterpret its own doctrines? The pressure on them from this flank is immense and invisible. Every pastor, every friend from that world, is now a potential judge. For Michelle, this is a particular crucifixion. Her identity was helpmeet. Her purpose was wife and mother. If she is no longer a wife by choice, what is she in the eyes of her faith? The journey to answer that question, whether she finds a more progressive spiritual home, abandons public faith altogether, or retreats into private penitence, will be one of the most compelling subplots of this saga. Jim Bob, the patriarch, now stands spiritually exposed. His leadership has failed in the most fundamental area, his own home. The theological framework he imposed is the very framework now used to judge him. The cognitive dissonance he must experience is staggering. We, the audience, are not passive observers in this. We are active participants. Our gaze for over a decade helped build the pressure cooker. Now, we've become a chorus of armchair psychologists, detectives, and judges. Online forums dedicated to the family, known colloquially as snark sites, have shifted from speculation to a kind of grim, real-time forensic analysis. Every blurred background in a family member's Instagram story is scrutinized for clues of where Michelle might be living. Every like or comment, or lack thereof, between family members on social media is charted like stock market fluctuations indicating alliances. The public's insatiable hunger for details has created a shadow economy of leaks and unnamed sources. This external pressure affects every decision. Does a child post a Mother's Day tribute? They're choosing a side. Do they stay silent? They're cold-hearted or controlled. There is no neutral act. The family, who once courted the spotlight, now finds it to be a hostile, unforgiving interrogator. The media, too, plays a dual role. Outlets that once published fluffy pieces about the Duggar laundry system now deploy teams to dig into Arkansas property records and courthouse filings. The narrative has flipped from inspiration to investigation. The family that controlled their message through a single TV network now has no control at all. The story is being written by court clerks and anonymous bloggers. And through all of this, the legal battles, the familial splits, the theological crises, hovers the ghost of the firstborn son, Joshua. Incarcerated, publicly disgraced, the original source of the family's great unraveling. How does his shadow fall on this divorce? Is he a point of shared, unspeakable grief that ultimately drove them apart, as each parent blames themselves or the other in silent, corrosive ways? Or was his crime and the family's initial handling of it the first, deep crack in their unified front, a betrayal between Jim Bob and Michelle that they could never fully articulate or heal? His presence is the elephant in every room. Do they discuss him in mediation? Is his future, his potential parole, part of the calculation? If one parent maintains contact while the other does not, does that become another wedge? He is both the cause and a symbol of the catastrophic failure of their project. And he remains a living, breathing reminder of why the perfect image was always a lie. So, where does it go from here? Let's project a few possible, perhaps likely, scenarios based on the fractured pieces we see. The Cold War. The divorce is finalized with a strict, confidential settlement. A non-disparagement clause is enforced. Publicly, they retreat into absolute silence. Jim Bob focuses on his remaining real estate and political interests. Michelle, perhaps with a financial settlement, lives near a daughter, her public life ended. They appear at grandchildren's events separately, a chilling, polite distance between them. The story never gets a true ending, it just fades into bitter, private history. The Manuscript Wars. The legal silence breaks when a tell-all book deal becomes too lucrative to refuse. Whose memoir arrives first? Michelle's, marketed as the true story from the heart of the empire, or a joint account from Jill and Jinger, framing it as a story of breaking free? Jim Bob would likely respond not with a book, but with legal challenges, trying to stop publication, creating a second wave of headlines. The family's private pain becomes, once again, a public commodity. The Spiritual Reckoning. One or both undergo a public transformation of faith. Michelle, in particular, could emerge as a surprising voice for women in high-control religions, a figure like a more reserved, shiny, happy people spokesperson. Or, they could both double down, framing the divorce as a personal failure within a still perfect system, a cautionary tale about straying from divine principles, thus locking themselves in a prison of their own making. The truth will likely be a messy combination of all three. But one thing is certain. The unified Duggar family brand is dead. In its place will be factions, competing narratives, and a generational scar that will define all of them, especially the grandchildren who will grow up knowing their family name as a synonym for scandal and fracture. We started with a clickbait headline, a shocking divorce. But as we've seen, that headline was merely the title page of a much darker, more complicated book. This is a story about the cost of perfection. About what happens when doctrine ignores human frailty. About the invisible labor of women in patriarchal systems. About the price children pay for their parents' ideals. And ultimately, about the terrifying freedom that comes when the cage, however gilded, finally breaks. Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar set out to create a testament to absolute certainty. They have instead created the ultimate testament to doubt, in systems, in leaders, and in the very foundations of a life built for show. The divorce is not the end of their story. It is the violent, painful birth of a dozen new ones. Stories of survival. Stories of silence. Stories of escape. And stories of a reckoning that is still echoing through the halls of a now empty Arkansas home, and through the hearts of the children who once called it theirs. The cameras are off. The depositions are just beginning. The world is watching. And the next chapter is being written in legal briefs and tear-filled prayers. We will be here, watching, when it breaks.